Welcome to topic 4302, EU compliance frameworks and funding opportunities. The central idea of this lecture is that sustainable urban and regional development depends on more than good intentions, technical design, or access to money. In the EU context, climate action is shaped by a layered system of policy goals, compliance requirements, and financial instruments. Our task is to understand how those layers fit together. This presentation therefore connects three things that are often discussed separately. First, we look at climate policy direction, especially global agreements and EU strategy. Second, we examine compliance mechanisms, meaning the rules, procedures, documentation requirements, and monitoring systems that make policy enforceable. Third, we review funding opportunities and the institutional capacity needed to access and implement them. By the end, you should be able to see why climate governance, regulatory quality, and project finance are all parts of the same implementation problem. The lecture follows a deliberate sequence. We begin with the broad policy context so that the technical terms do not appear detached from their purpose. After that, we move into compliance, because funding in the EU is rarely a matter of simply receiving money and spending it freely. Then we introduce carbon market basics and climate finance concepts, because both are important for understanding how environmental goals are translated into operational and financial decisions. In the second half of the presentation, we move toward more applied questions. We map the main EU funding landscape that matters for cities and regions, especially cohesion policy. We then review the evidence base on how structural funds and related instruments affect regional outcomes. Finally, we test the lecture's main claims through two cases, one on operator-level regulatory compliance and one on administrative capacity in fund implementation. This structure is designed to help you move from concepts to mechanisms and then from mechanisms to practical lessons. The learning objectives are straightforward but demanding. First, you are expected to describe the main principles of international and European climate policy, including the European Green Deal and global climate agreements. Second, you should identify basic concepts related to EU compliance requirements, climate finance, and carbon market mechanisms. Third, you should be able to interpret how policy, regulation, and financial instruments interact in support of sustainable urban development. The next objectives take us into application and judgment. You should be able to examine simple cases and explain how compliance frameworks and funding opportunities operate in practice. Finally, you are expected to develop awareness of why governance quality matters. In other words, this is not only a knowledge topic. It is also a skills and attitude topic. Good climate projects fail when institutions cannot procure properly, report reliably, or demonstrate results. So while we will learn concepts, our deeper goal is to think like careful project planners and public managers. A common mistake in project planning is to separate the finance question from the governance question. People often ask, what funding can we apply for? Before asking, can we actually comply with the rules that come with that funding? In the EU system, those two questions must be asked together. Funding is attached to eligibility criteria, public procurement requirements, reporting obligations, environmental safeguards, monitoring indicators, and audit expectations. This is especially important in climate-related projects. Sustainable mobility, energy efficiency, urban regeneration, climate adaptation, or low-carbon infrastructure projects all produce benefits that must be demonstrated, not simply claimed. That means project teams need measurement systems, documentation routines, and credible reporting pathways. The practical lesson is that a city or region should not pursue funding as if compliance were a final administrative formality. Compliance should be designed into the project from the beginning. Otherwise, even technically strong proposals can underperform, trigger corrections, or become difficult to defend in audit and evaluation processes. At the global level, the Paris Agreement provides the broad governance umbrella for climate action. It does not dictate one identical policy for every country. Instead, it organizes action around nationally determined contributions, transparency expectations, and regular reporting. This matters because it creates a structure in which climate ambition is linked to accountability. Countries commit, report, review, and revise. Cities and regions are not formal treaty parties, but they operate inside this wider accountability environment. National climate plans influence domestic priorities, regulatory changes, and investment frameworks. EU climate instruments are also shaped by this global context. As a result, local governments increasingly work in a policy environment where measurable results, emissions logic, and credible reporting are normal expectations. The key insight here is that global governance is not abstract. It affects local implementation indirectly by shaping how programs are designed, what outcomes are prioritized, and how progress must be demonstrated. If the Paris Agreement is the global umbrella, the European Green Deal is the major EU strategic umbrella. It gives political direction to the transition toward climate neutrality and a greener growth model. In practice, this direction reaches cities and regions through regulatory packages, investment priorities, program guidance, and expectations around results. For local and regional actors, the Green Deal matters in two connected ways. First, it creates or strengthens funding opportunities for projects related to decarbonization, energy efficiency, circularity, green infrastructure, and sustainable mobility. Second, it raises the importance of implementation quality. Green transition funding is not just about spending quickly. It is about showing that projects are aligned with policy objectives, that safeguards are respected, and that outcomes can be documented. So the Green Deal should not be understood as a slogan or a single fund. It is better understood as a strategic frame that influences what is financed, how it is justified, and what kind of administrative discipline is expected in delivery. In practice, compliance is not one rule but a bundle of rules and procedures. It includes eligibility requirements, procurement standards, environmental and legal safeguards, monitoring routines, record keeping, reporting quality, and audit readiness. This is why many implementation failures are not purely technical or engineering failures. They are compliance failures. A project may have a good substantive goal, but still fail because the procurement file is weak, the audit trail is incomplete, or the reporting system cannot verify results. This is one of the most important applied lessons in the topic. Administrative quality is not an afterthought. It is part of project design. In climate and urban development projects, this matters because public authorities and funders need confidence that the money was used lawfully and that the outputs and outcomes are real. The stronger the compliance culture of an institution, the easier it becomes to convert policy ambition into defendable results. Weak compliance systems, by contrast, can waste both money and political credibility. Carbon markets are one of the clearest examples of how policy goals are turned into measurable obligations. In a cap-and-trade system, an overall emissions limit is set, and regulated entities must surrender allowances that correspond to their emissions. The system creates scarcity and uses tradable units to manage emissions under the cap. The EU emissions trading system is the best-known European example. Why is this relevant for topic 4302? Because it shows that climate governance increasingly depends on measurement, reporting, and verification. A carbon market cannot work on vague claims. It requires robust data and compliance systems. Even when a city project is not directly inside the EU ETS, the broader lesson still applies. Climate policy instruments often require traceable evidence, credible reporting, and auditable procedures. This means that regulatory literacy matters not only for lawyers or ministries, but also for project managers, urban planners, and local authorities who operate in climate-related funding and implementation environments. Climate finance should be understood as a broad family of financial flows and instruments that support climate-related action. It includes public budgets, private investment, concessional arrangements, blended structures, and programs that use public funds to reduce risk or improve the feasibility of projects. Reducing climate finance to grants alone is too narrow. The practical relevance is clear. Different projects require different financing structures, and the credibility of those structures depends on compliance and performance systems. Funders want to know whether the intervention is additional, whether the outcomes can be measured, and whether public resources are being used properly. This is why weak reporting systems can do more than create paperwork problems. They can directly undermine trust and future access to funding. So climate finance and compliance should be seen as mutually reinforcing. Good finance design without governance discipline is fragile, and strong rules without usable funding pathways are insufficient for implementation. For many cities and regions, the most important practical funding architecture is cohesion policy. It is often described as the EU's main investment policy, and that description is meaningful for this topic. Through funds such as the European Regional Development Fund and the Cohesion Fund, The EU supports infrastructure, energy transition, environmental improvement, sustainable mobility, and wider regional development priorities. An important feature of cohesion policy is shared management. This means implementation relies heavily on national and regional administrative systems. In other words, European funding is not delivered in a vacuum from Brussels directly to every local project. It passes through multi-level governance arrangements that depend on program design, selection systems, managing authorities, procurement routines, and audit structures. That is why the same amount of funding may produce different results in different regions. Access to money matters, but so does the institutional machinery that allocates, manages, documents, and reviews how that money is used. Another important lesson is that compliance is tested repeatedly during the life of a project. It is not limited to the moment of application. There are checks at project selection, then further checks during contracting and procurement, further checks during implementation and monitoring, and later checks in control and audit stages. Problems that appear small early on can become large later when evidence is missing or indicators cannot be substantiated. This has a direct management implication. Building compliance capacity early is usually cheaper than correcting mistakes later. Clear documentation systems, reliable monitoring indicators, version control, procurement discipline, and internal review procedures are not bureaucratic extras. They are risk reduction tools. In climate projects, where performance claims can attract scrutiny, this matters even more. An authority that understands the full funding lifecycle is better positioned to avoid financial corrections, delays, and reputational damage. Good project delivery therefore depends on designing both the technical intervention and the implementation system around it. The first major evidence point in the deck comes from research by Becker, Egger, and von Ehrlich on the effect of EU structural funds on regional performance. Their work is important because it does not simply assume that funding is helpful. It tries to identify causal effects. In the way this topic uses the article, the key finding is that structural funds can generate positive GDP per capita effects, but the picture is more nuanced when looking at other outcomes, especially employment. This matters for planning and evaluation. Project teams often expect all desirable indicators to improve together. Yet policy interventions may affect output, productivity, employment, inclusion, or environmental performance differently and at different speeds. The practical lesson is to choose indicators carefully and align them with the intervention logic. Good evaluation is not just a reporting requirement, it is part of honest policy learning. If a project influences one dimension more strongly than another, that does not automatically mean failure, but it does require careful interpretation. A second lesson from the cohesion policy literature is that more funding is not always better in a linear way. Becker, Egger, and von Ehrlich also point to diminishing returns and the possibility that transfer intensity can exceed an efficient level in some contexts. That means the same additional euro does not necessarily produce the same benefit everywhere. This is a valuable warning for program design. It suggests that project quality, targeting, and absorptive capacity matter as much as budget size. A weak institution may struggle to transform larger allocations into stronger outcomes. Likewise, a poorly targeted intervention may consume resources without addressing the most binding local constraints. The governance message is therefore clear: spending volume should not be treated as a substitute for strategic selection. Better project pipelines, stronger screening criteria, and more capable management systems may improve outcomes more than simply increasing allocations. The presentation then turns to the importance of targeting, drawing on work by Di Cataldo and Monasterotis. Their relevance for this topic lies in the idea that outcomes depend not only on how much money is spent, but also on whether funds are matched to actual regional needs. This is crucial in EU policy because territories differ in economic structure, social challenges, institutional capacity, and development gaps. For practitioners, the lesson is to build a disciplined chain from needs assessment to objectives, from objectives to selection criteria, and from selection criteria to indicators. Weak targeting produces weak outcomes, even when implementation is formally correct. In urban and regional development, this means climate-related projects should not be chosen only because they fit a fashionable theme or a broad call. They should also respond to a clearly diagnosed local problem. When the needs objectives indicators chain is strong, the intervention becomes easier to justify, manage, and evaluate. Another important evidence-based lesson comes from research on Greece by Psycharis, Celios, and Pantazis. Their work helps the presentation make a broader point. The apparent impact of public investment can vary depending on the time period studied and the spatial scale used in analysis. A result that looks weak in the short term may appear differently over a longer horizon. Likewise, patterns visible at one geographic scale may not appear in the same way at another. For project teams and evaluators, this means that methods matter. Evaluation design should never be treated as an afterthought. If expected impacts are long-term, then short-term indicators may understate them. If benefits spill across municipal boundaries, then narrow local metrics may miss part of the effect. The practical takeaway is not that evaluation is unreliable, but that it must be designed carefully. Good funding and good policy still require good analytical framing if we want to understand what is working and why. Institutional quality and digitalization are presented as drivers of access to European funds. This point is highly practical. When people hear administrative capacity, they often think only of staff numbers or formal authority. But capacity is broader. It includes digital systems, data quality, procedural clarity, transparency, coordination routines, and the ability to produce reliable documentation. Digitalization matters because many compliance tasks are information tasks. They involve tracking deadlines, storing documents, verifying outputs, producing audit trails, and linking financial data with performance data. Poor systems increase the likelihood of error, delay, inconsistency, and weak reporting. Strong systems can improve absorption, accelerate implementation, and reduce uncertainty in controls and audits. For sustainable urban and regional development, this means governance modernization is not peripheral. Investments in digital and administrative systems can be enabling conditions for successful climate project delivery and for more effective use of European funds. At this point in the lecture, the big picture should be visible. Policy goals set direction. Compliance mechanisms translate direction into operational obligations. Financial instruments mobilize resources. Delivery capacity determines whether resources become outcomes. Topic 4302 is really about understanding this full chain rather than isolating any single element. This integrated view is especially useful for urban and regional practitioners. Cities often think first in terms of projects, such as building retrofits, clean mobility, adaptation infrastructure, or green public space. But every project sits inside a governance environment. If that environment is weak, then the project may suffer from delayed procurement, poor reporting, weak verification, or low absorption. The lesson is not pessimistic. It is practical. Better outcomes are possible when institutions align project design, compliance planning, financing strategy, and implementation systems from the start rather than treating them as disconnected tasks handled by separate teams. The first case study illustrates regulatory compliance at the operator level through implementation of the European timber regulation by German importing operators. The case is useful because it shows that compliance problems are often concrete and procedural, not merely theoretical. Rules may be clear at the legislative level, yet implementation can still break down because due diligence is incomplete, information is missing, incentives are uneven, or operators do not treat compliance as a core operational task. This case offers a transferable lesson for urban and regional development. Compliance cannot be added at the end of a project like a final checklist. It has to be built into daily routines. Whether the issue is timber legality, procurement, environmental safeguards, or emissions reporting, the deeper governance question is the same: are procedures designed so that compliance can actually happen in practice? If the answer is no, the gap between policy intention and real-world implementation grows quickly. The second case focuses on southern Italy and asks whether differences in administrative capacity can help explain differences in regional performance under structural funds implementation. This case is highly relevant because it shifts attention from formal access to funds toward the ability to turn allocations into projects, expenditures, and results. The implication is direct. A region can have money available and still underperform if its institutions cannot plan, manage, procure, monitor, and document effectively. For sustainable urban development, this is a crucial reminder. Funding opportunities should never be assessed only by headline budget numbers. Authorities also need to ask whether they have the internal systems needed to use the money well. This includes monitoring tools, procurement competence, project pipelines, interdepartmental coordination, and audit readiness. The case therefore reinforces one of the strongest messages in the topic: governance quality is not separate from development outcomes. It is one of their conditions. To conclude, Topic 4302 argues that sustainable urban and regional development depends on a chain of alignment. Global and European climate policy frameworks set the direction of travel. Compliance systems convert that direction into enforceable expectations. Funding instruments make action financially possible. Administrative quality and institutional capacity determine whether the intended action is actually delivered. This final synthesis should guide how you think about project development. When evaluating a funding opportunity, do not ask only whether the project idea is attractive. Also ask whether the proposal is policy aligned, whether the compliance obligations are manageable, whether the indicator system is credible, and whether the institution has the capacity to carry the project through audit and evaluation. That is the practical mindset this topic is trying to build. Strong climate governance is not only about ambition. It is about the disciplined combination of strategy, rules, finance, and implementation capacity.